Hey folks. So a few weeks ago, I played in this Chess24 Halloween Blitz tournament, the Monster Mystery Tournament, which was obviously a lot of fun. I got to play as Spider-Man, and I knew going into the tournament I was going to be playing a strong player, but the point was everyone was going to be playing in a mask, and you couldn't tell who your opponent was. Now, obviously, by this point, most of you guys probably know I didn't actually, in fact, end up playing Peter Leko, so I apologize for the, the grotesque clickbait title. But you have to understand, during the match, I really strongly felt that I was facing, the former candidate, commentator, super GM player Peter Leko. Whereas it turns out, in fact, I wasn't. And I'll explain a little bit why I thought I was playing who I was playing as we go through the match. But if you want to find out who it actually was, of course, you'll have to wait until the very end, unless you want to just like Google it or something. So this was essentially like a knockout blitz match. The time control was 3+2, and we started out with best of 3 games. I got white in the first game. And I just want to go through a couple of the moments in the game because I thought the games were really interesting and they had a lot of instructive details. And as you can see, I could see that my opponent was wearing this mummy mask. I saw the glasses, and then he like plays b6 here, the Queen's Indian. So instantly my mind just like shot to Peter Leko. He's a Queen's Indian expert. The guy wears glasses. He's affiliated with Chess24, so he easily could be in the tournament. And also looking at his Chess24 rating, it was like 3,100, and the flag next to his username was of course Hungary. So once I saw these details, I was like monk. I just put it all together. And I was like, oh man, I'm playing Peter Leko, what an honor. Anyway, that actually made it really tough to play the game, of course, because, when you have a lot of respect for your opponent, it's hard to remain objective, and we'll see what happened. So he goes for this knight a6 move. This rook e1 line is already trendy. This is a pretty reasonable response to it. And the point is that white is basically trying to delay knight c3 here in view of knight e4. It has other moves. I tried bishop f4. I think nowadays h4 is pretty popular here as well. I didn't really know what was happening in this opening. Apparently, we were following a game between Vidit and Van Foreest, Lucas, which I would later discover my opponent was probably well familiar with. Here black plays c takes d4. I mean, we basically have like very normal type of Queen's Indian position, a lot of tension in the center. But we get some complications right off the bat. cd4, queen takes d4, bishop c5, queen d2, and knight to e4. Basically forcing me to take d takes d4, and I would say this was maybe one of the critical moments in the game already. I kind of panicked here and I played this move a3, which I felt like was useful. I covered the b4 square, I stopped bishop b4, I stopped knight b4, and it seemed like a reasonable move. According to Stockfish, stronger was this idea of queen c2, just going after the e4 pawn, but also opening up the d file for the rook and threatening like rook a d1. So this was quite an unpleasant threat. And any move like f6 can be met with rook d1 and then knight d7, forking and probably taking the dark squared bishop. I think during the game, I probably just rejected this move on principle out of just seeing knight b4 and feeling annoyed by it. But after queen b1, black's activity just very quickly runs out here. White will play rook d1, a3, kick the knight away, and one day might even just think about winning the e4 pawn. So that was my kind of one chance for the advantage there out of the opening. After a3, this turns out just to be a huge mistake because black trades queens and goes bishop to d4. And all of a sudden my knight on e5 is almost lost, pawn on b2 is hanging. I have to play bishop c3 just to hold everything. And now, of course, the pawns are super weak and black is just completely crushing. Now things get even worse. I play a4, and I actually meant to play rook ev1 here, but somehow I immediately play a5, forgetting about knight b3 fork, rook a4, knight takes a5. Now I played rook b1, threatening rook takes a5, rook takes b7, and my opponent really quickly played rook f d8. So then I was like, oh wow, So if I take on a5, take, rook takes b7, rook d1, bishop f1, I just immediately rejected this. You know, my bishop is passive, black's a pawn is running, and, you know, two rooks are probably going to be dominating here. But as it turns out, this was just a completely wrong evaluation. In fact, white is fine, and maybe it's black who actually has to be careful here, because I'm always going to be able to unpin very quickly with king g2 and e3, and the bishop will get out. My rook is threatening to take on a7 and just immediately go after the a pawn. And yeah, it's actually not that easy for black to even hold this position themselves. If they push a4, just rook takes a7, and the pawn is not really going to be going anywhere. f7 is also kind of hanging here. If black plays f6, I think this is the best case scenario, knight g4, something like rook c1, knight e3, and according to Stockfish, it's about equal, but that's the best position, you know, I've seen all game. So I don't know why I didn't go for this. I think I was just giving too much respect to my opponent, thinking like, oh man, I'm going to get killed after rook d1 check, and I ended up just playing, you know, h4. And okay, trying to create luft and, well, giving my opponent time to just defend the knight on a5, which is just completely wrong, and now white is hopelessly lost. Okay, it was a blitz game, it was kind of messy from here, but ultimately black kind of did what he needed to do to win the game, winning enough material here. I tried to pose some problems here, but here after knight g5, he finds this kind of accurate move, rook c8, covering the back rank. And even though I get a little bit of activity here, it's ultimately not enough after h6, kicking the knight away. And black is able to get his knight to e4 and pick up the c3 pawn. And yeah, it was basically all over after this. So that was game one. In game two, I was playing black, and the opening was actually goes into a mainline King's Indian, which I was pretty happy to see. Here after bishop e2, I played this move c6, and at this point in my mind, I'm just like 100% I'm playing Leko. You know, I don't exactly remember his d4 repertoire, but I'm sure he's faced the King's Indian many times in his life. So I tried this move c6. I think it's a pretty flexible move for blitz, and we end up getting castles, e5, bishop e3, knight a6, and we kind of transposed to the knight a6 King's Indian, where white has played bishop e3. Here my opponent thought for a little bit and played rook e1, which as far as I remember is pretty topical but tricky move. I thought a little bit about what I'd analyzed, and I remembered that I'd wanted to play rook e8 in this position. I think I analyzed this a few years ago when the line was like really popular and I was playing it a lot. And I actually got to demonstrate some nice ideas over the board. I believe the main move in these positions is usually just to play d5, and then after knight g4 we just get typical King's Indian play. But my opponent played d takes e5, and I almost just took back immediately de, which is the normal instinct. But then I remember that it's in this exact line where black can go knight g4, which is actually kind of a funny trick. And the point is, of course, we're attacking the bishop, but usually this doesn't work because after bishop g5, black gets a tempo on the queen, and then, or white gets a tempo on the queen, and black is not going to be in time to take the e5 pawn back. But here black has this fantastic move, queen b6, with a double attack on f2 and b2, taking advantage of the fact that the rook had already moved to e1. So actually, sometimes this is how you can remember like specific opening details, is if you remember particular quirks about the position, like, oh, this queen b6 only works because white played rook e1, otherwise white would be totally fine here, then that can kind of help you, that can help like trigger your memory during the game. So instead, after knight g4, well, if white plays bishop f4, then again, we can play like queen b6, we can possibly take on e5 as well. But my opponent played, I would say, the critical move here, queen takes d6. So he can grab a second pawn, but give up his dark-squared bishop in the process. And we end up reaching this endgame where white has two extra pawns, but they're tripled on the e-file. So really interesting position, really interesting one to analyze. I believe that black is objectively totally fine. I played this move rook e8, which as far as I had remembered was my prep. I'm not totally sure. I think bishop g4 is also possible in this position, just immediately trying to trade off and winning back one of the extra pawns, where black will just have tremendous compensation for the rest of the game. But I tried this move and we end up getting like a really interesting position, rook 81, knight c5, here b4 is played. b4 probably a little bit of an inaccuracy after knight to d7. Basically white is just kind of pushing black to where I want to go, and now I'm going to be able to pick up one of the pawns, and then I again have tons of compensation against the doubled e-pawns from there. So I did have my chances in this game. Here after knight d4, I play this move a5, white played b5, and unfortunately I play this move bishop f8, kind of allowing knight a4, which basically gives white this nice grip on the position, although black is still, I think, quite okay. But better was this nice move a4, which I wish I had seen. I think it's kind of an instructive idea, just fixing the square for black, not allowing white to play knight a4, and then preparing to play the move bishop f8 and knight d7, and going after this c5 pawn in the future, where, okay, obviously black's dark squared bishop in this position is just a really strong piece. So bishop f8, knight a4, and okay, I just start getting my pieces out. And I actually miss another chance here after bishop h6. Surprisingly, white has this move knight f5 here, which both me and my opponent missed in this position, but white ends up using in just a bit. Instead, white plays king f2, defending the e-pawn, and I actually had very simple opportunity here. Instead of bishop g4, which is what I played, just go knight g4 check. Well, e3 pawn is under attack. White kind of has to take on g4, bishop takes g4, and then I'm simply hitting the rook on d1 and the pawn on e4. So I think my opponent might have overlooked this. I definitely just didn't realize I'm hitting the pawn on e4 at the end of this line. And yeah, once black wins back the pawns, I mean the two rooks, the two bishops, everything is just fantastic for black. Instead, I play bishop g4, and yeah, we get a pretty messy game. White finds this nice trick with knight f5. Unleashing in-between check attack on the bishop on h6, and of course rook on d8 hanging. I got to take on d2. Fortunately, I'm not just losing after blundering this trick, because I have king g7 and I can win back the piece. But we end up getting into this endgame here, and I'm still down one pawn, but trying to create some counterplay. Rook d6, takes. I played f5. Typical blitz move, just kind of supporting the knight, maybe trying to play rook d8 and rook d2 in the future, getting some counterplay. And here white actually makes a surprising error with knight to d5 after the move knight c4. White is doing really well, basically should be winning this endgame with best play. Knight d5 was a mistake actually, because after rook e5 it turns out, well, the knight is hanging and the pawn on c5 is hanging, and white actually has no way of defending both. So I end up kind of lucking out in this one. I take the pawn on c5. All of a sudden we have equal material. If anything, black might be slightly better due to the structure. And white plays knight d3. I start playing for the win here actually, because I had kind of misunderstood how the match worked. I actually thought it was best of 2 games. You know, we play one game white, one game black. And since my opponent had won the first game, then I would need to win this game to stay in the match. So I thought it was like a 2-game knockout format, but it's actually a 3-game, which meant that even with a draw in this game, there would still be a 3rd game. Well, not knowing that, I try to play for a win, which I kind of wish I would just do in every situation. So I'm thinking this might be a good trick to just always think you have to be playing for the win, and it'll make you play a lot more ambitiously. Anyway, we get this rook endgame. I avoid the trade of rooks. It would have gone into some complex king and pawn endgame that with 20 seconds on the clock, I just had no chance of calculating. Instead, I keep the rooks on the board. And we get kind of a pawn race going here, but ultimately things end up pretty drawish here. As I have the h-pawn and the g-pawn, and this creates a lot of counterplay. Unfortunately, my king can't stay active because white will push a7, and then the rook will give a check from behind. So I'm forced to keep my king on g7, h7 here, and things eventually pretty much just liquidate, and the game was soon drawn. So yeah, I actually thought the match was over, and I almost took my mask off, which we were instructed to do after we lost the match. But thankfully, I realized that there was actually a game 3 that we're supposed to play, and yeah, we ended up going into the third game. So in game 3, I again had white. I played d4 here, and now I need to win to stay in the match and force an Armageddon tiebreak. And here my opponent played the Dutch, which should have actually been a little bit of a red flag that maybe my opponent isn't who I thought it was, because I immediately thought, like, Leko playing the Dutch, like that doesn't seem right. Anyway, I played kind of my main line, and black ends up going for a stone wall. And then I kind of just convinced myself, oh, it's a stone wall Dutch. Yeah, maybe Leko plays this. I don't know. So I played a line that I think is pretty topical nowadays. Actually, it's, I think, more accurate to start with knight h3 rather than knight d2 blocking off the bishop. But in general, the idea is to play knight h3, bring this other knight to f3, and then the bishop can come out to f4. And honestly, I think this was probably my worst game of the 3. I just feel like I didn't play well at all here. Queen c2, I think this is inaccurate. White instead should castle first and then wait on queen c2. Here black plays knight e4, castles knight c6, and this is already kind of showing why queen c2 is a little bit awkward. Black has this tempo with knight b4 that can kind of just create some discomfort in white's position. I play knight f3, knight b4, a5, and I think black is already just totally fine here. a3, a4, queen goes back, knight c6. To be fair, white is also fine. I go bishop f4, bishop e6. And here I really lament not just trading off the dark squared bishops immediately. I mean, I think black is, again, totally fine, but this position would certainly be playable, and at least I know what I'm doing. I'm putting the rook on c1, the knight is coming to f4 and d3, and then I'm going to try to use my knights on the squares c5 and e5. And I mean, white can easily be better here if black is not careful. But instead I first played this move rook c1, just figuring, okay, I can always take next move. And of course my opponent goes bishop e7, avoiding the trade, which is actually like a thematic idea in this line, to avoid the trade of dark squared bishops and set up this unpleasant threat of g5. So I really should have sniffed this one out. Now the best move was knight e5, just trading off this knight on c6 and giving my pieces some squares. I can play f3 next and bring the knight back into play somehow. Instead I played a pretty bad move, bishop e3, black goes g5 anyway, and now black is just totally dominating and totally taking over the king side here. Threat is of course g4, and yeah, I just have to start moving backwards with my pieces. So knight d2, h6, very simple. I played f3, knight d6. I think very solid move, just not trading off and kind of letting me free my position a little bit. Here I decided to play knight b1. I felt like this was the only way I can get my knight to a decent square, which I think would have been a reasonable move if not for my opponent's response, knight c4, which now just hits the bishop on e3, hits the pawn on b2, everything is kind of collapsing. I decide to sack the exchange because, yeah, basically what else? Knight c3. And now there's a few ways to deal with the threat of d5, but here my opponent finds, I think, one of basically the strongest move, just very simple, bishop f6, and the point is now on d5. Black is just going to take on c3 and liquidate into a winning endgame. If I don't play d5, I mean the pawn on d4 is currently hanging, so yeah, basically white is just lost, so I had to try this. Takes on c6, queen trades, bishop b2. I was hoping, to get something with my pawn on b7, but of course black's rook is controlling the square very nicely, and black's c-pawn ends up being just too strong, and yeah, this was the end of the game. So tough match. I ended up losing 2.5, but I didn't feel bad about it. I mean, you play such a strong player, it's just a pleasure to participate in the first place, and I thought the games were interesting and had a lot of cool moments. So of course after the match I didn't find out who my opponent was, so I just went to bed that night thinking I had played Peter Leko, and then the next day I had found out that in fact I had not played Leko. I was facing Dutch GM Erwin Lamy, from the Netherlands. So yeah, it was definitely a big surprise there. But then when I looked at the mummy again, I was like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. That does kind of look like Erwin. So shout out to Erwin. Thanks for the very enjoyable match. And yeah, thanks again to Chess24 for inviting me. That was definitely a blast to play in this event. That's going to wrap it up for this video, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already for more instructional chess content, and I'll catch you guys next time. Take care.